I was out shopping today and I happened to see our local newspaper, The Western People, and there's an article in it by a local priest called Father Brendan Hoban, who is one of the members of the Irish, the Association of Catholic Priests. And this is the article. We can choose between two versions of God. Anyway, I thought I'd just read it out and comment on some of this because he's making he's making up facts for you here. Just wanted to kind of draw you through some stuff. Some weeks ago, Catholics celebrated, as we do every year, the feast of Christ the King. It's usually on the last Sunday of the church's calendar, or the Sunday before the first Sunday of Advent. It usually falls around the end of November. Christ the King is not an ancient feast, as it's not even so it even hasn't age or heritage to commend it. Might like to just read the sign they put above the cross when they killed our Lord. But anyway, just Pope Pius the 11th just introduced it in 1927 to remind Christians of their allegiance to their spiritual ruler in heaven, as opposed to earthly supremacy. There's a lot more around why he introduced it. It'd be good if he explained it a bit more. But anyway. However, in the 100 years since, royalty and kingship seem to have lost their sheen. Even hereditary monarchies have fallen on hard times, and those still surviving, as in the UK, are little more than ceremonial presence on the sidelines of society with little or no political power. Once royalty mattered, or was respected, or even sometimes loved. Not anymore. The brand has lost its substance, not least because of recent antics of royals. The rise of democracy, with all its faults and limitations, has also helped to isolate royalty as a relic of distant past. The royal dividend now delivers whatever value it retains in attracting tourists or in children's stories where kings and queens are part of the magic mix of palaces, dungeons, crowns and sceptres, or at least where before Harry Potter upped that particular ant. So, where am I going with this? Let me push my cards on the table. I'm not gone on celebrating Jesus as a king, or at least that celebrates his kingship. Now, you might understand why our diocese has no vocations. This is a priest from here. As I understand it, Jesus came among us to reveal God to us in simple terms, to show us what God was like. Philippians 2:5-8 is a key scriptural text, part of which reads, Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. The writer Brian McLaren points out apparent discrepancies between the God in as supreme being, meaning almighty being, omnipotent, all-powerful, who dominates as tradition, his stereotypically represented God the Father, as in full and absolute control. The image of God represented by Jesus, who we describe as the revelation of God. As we know from reading the New Testament, Jesus presented a very different image of God the Father. There is no sign of supremacy of God, who's more obvious in the Old Testament. First command, love your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind. As we know from reading the New Testament, Jesus presented a very different image of God the Father. On the other hand, the God that Jesus reveals and exemplifies, who we might call the God of the New Testament, is the very opposite of a king. The image of Jesus puts before us seems completely out of variance with the image of God of the Old Testament, a God who dominates, controls, demands, and is aggressive, even sometimes violent and warlike. In a recent article, in the Irish Dominican Journal, Conversations, John Scally quotes a scriptural scholar. There are 600 passages of explicit violence in the Hebrew Old Testament Bible. 1,000 verses where God's own violent actions, punishment are described. 100 passages where Yahweh, God, expressly commands another to kill people, and several stories where God kills or tries to kill for no apparent reason. In comparison, the image of God that Jesus represents to us in the New Testament is very different from the image of God in the Old Testament. The God that Jesus represents is the very opposite of the violent and sometimes warlike God. Not a dominating God even to the extent of physical violence, but a servant God who carries a basin and a towel to wash the feet of the disciples. Not a God who threatens hellfire and brimstone, but a gentle God, weeping in compassion for his people. He did speak about hell the odd time, Christ did. You can be lost, but anyway, we pick and choose. Supermarket Catholicism is all in vogue. It might even be said, as John Scally suggests, that the article mentioned above, the Old Testament God represents the form of aggressive masculinity. That perpetuates a toxic masculinity that is causing such devastation in our world. The corollary is the image of God represented by Jesus in the New Testament is a gentler, kinder, more loving, more human, and even more feminine God. Whereas the Old Testament God was the one that exuded fear and whom the fires of hell were held over people like the swords of Damocles. The New Testament God is one of gentle and loving care, who is the bearer of good news, and our God is a God of love, and we are loved by God beyond all of our imagining. The spiritual writer, the Dominican priest Donogh O'Shea, wrote recently in examining the Old Green Catechism, many of us learned off by heart in national school, it was found that the word love was never mentioned, even once. Let me finish this. It is any wondering that so many of us have spent so much of our lives in thrall of the Old Testament God, submitting us to lifetimes of terror and oppression, and missing out on the New Testament God who represented love and care. God's love, Donogh O'Shea has written, is not a bounty we have to earn, but a gift that is offered to us that's life-enriching, liberating, and often a sheer joy. So, gentle reader, we look forward to another year. Can I leave you with the question to mull over? Is your God the God of the Old Testament or of the New? Now, I thought, God, the word love is not mentioned one single time in the Old Green Catechism of the Irish Church. Well, the two guys here quoting it, one quoting another guy, but they must have read it. But you know what I did? This little exercise. I went and downloaded the catechism. Went Control F and looked up the word, which appeared practically on every second page of the old catechism published in 1951 by the Irish bishops. But, when we're inventing stories, we have to perpetuate our whatever. And I have no idea who this Dominican is, but I did expect a little bit better from the Dominicans. Not only is love mentioned 40 odd times in the old thing, it talks about a God being of all good. If the word is mentioned, but also by analogy, you can experience this God of all good. As regards Christ the King, Christ came to introduce us to his kingdom. He's a king. He didn't want to be a king like any of the other kings in this world. He didn't want power in this world. He wanted to open us to the understanding of his kingdom, his love, his Father. And when I went to seminary, we were educated about the progressive revelation of God through salvation history. From Adam to Christ, how God is progressively showing himself, revealing himself, bringing his children together. And Christ is the Word made flesh, the Logos, the love. He is a king in every sense of the word, but not an earthly king that we slot him down. Oh yeah, you're the king of Israel. This because they wanted to make him a king of Israel, but he didn't want to be a king, like a king of Israel and a king of this country and that kingdom and all this. He would just be another earthly figure, and he was far more than that. I find it very sad that a retired priest like this would write an article like this, that first of all, he doesn't know his facts, theologically, historically. He hasn't read that catechism, and he certainly didn't learn it off by heart, because he would have remembered that it's mentioned there 40 odd times. And not only that, by analogy, we experience the God of love. There are truths in our Catholic faith, and this is what people need to understand. There are truths in our Catholic faith that you have to preach. You have to warn about the errors in your life, the potholes that you can come across. What sin, the reality of sin in this world and in the next. And I know he wrote another article a few years ago that in 30 years of ministry, if he'd confessed 10 people or something a year or something like this, it was a lot. And, he doesn't he doesn't seem to think that confession is an important sacrament. And he doesn't like traditional priests. And this guy gets published in newspapers. His inventions get published in newspapers. People read these things and think, oh, this priest must know things. He doesn't. I'm sorry. He doesn't. He doesn't. I don't know what he was taught in Irish seminary, but sadly, this is the craziness that was going on in the 60s and the 70s. Yes, God is a God of love. But he asks you to elect him, to choose him. If we look at this so enlightened Ireland, this modern Ireland, because, I do have a small outreach ministry here in Ireland. Not something that I ever envisaged having, but, people come up to me in the street and said, oh, I saw your video. One man came up to me and he said, well, I was about to take my life, and my life was in a very difficult situation. I was in my bed and I saw your video and it changed my life, and I just wanted to thank you. And I said, oh, thank you very much. But at the end of the day, it's not me that did this. It's our Lord. But there's a lot of people living in hell today in Ireland because we haven't given them the good news, and we haven't taught them the consequences of sin. Sin has temporal consequences, societal consequences, consequences in the world. If you're a drug addict or an alcoholic, or you've suffered sexual violence, we don't teach the virtues or teach people how to practice the virtues or teach them how to practice the Catholic faith or spiritual warfare or any of this. And then we'll invent nonsense in newspapers about the word love not being in the old catechism. God save me. But I give this video in good faith. But I just ask the Irish Church, please wake up. Wake up. Don't go be publishing nonsense in Irish newspapers, inventing another history. Who is Christ? What was his kingship really about? Why did they nail a piece of wood on top of the cross, or put a crown on him, or clothe him? It's very sad. But look, I suggest just picking up the gospel and going through the gospel end to end. Also, read the mystic Maria Valtorta. It will really change your understanding of what Christ was trying to do. Anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.